Hey guys, today's story is going to be about a DM that can't take criticism and only wants praise. Hello strangers. I've never posted in here before, but after remembering a few games, I decided I might as well tell the story of some of these games. The Prologue. The story began a few years ago. I was getting into TTRPGs. At that point, all I had really done was GM for Call of Cthulhu and Pulp Cthulhu. That's when, one day, I had a player walk into one of my games of Pulp, offering me to join a game of D&D hosted by a friend of his. Always interested by play, I decided to move into it. The time was perfect. The GM, upon first contact, seemed cool, though slightly weeby. He was going to host Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition, and I was certainly interested. I invited a friend over to join as well, because there were only 3 players. We brainstorm, and as we're both new, come up with a bizarre duo of characters. A half-orc barbarian, mob enforcer, whose boss is actually dead. But he didn't want the gang's morale to fall, so he pretended that the boss was in hiding for a while whilst fulfilling his role. And my friend played a halfling rogue assassin who is a hotshot and the best friend of my half-orc. They were on the run from a cult when the city they controlled was sabotaged and sieged from the inside. The GM had not told us of his world up until this point. After reading our characters, he thought they would fit in perfectly. His world was an interesting idea. Essentially, humans live on one side in the deserts, whilst the more niche races live in the far realms, where they are secluded due to some old war from eons ago. However, he denied us to have a minor gang. I think my half-orc had 2 other men excluding him and the halfling. We just went with 2 criminals on the run from a sinister cult. The other players were some Warforged monk, who was the guy that invited me, a gnome artificer who made the Warforged, and a druid, who didn't show up, so I don't know his race. After a couple of weeks involving discussion and planning, we had our first and last game in that campaign. It went mostly alright, other than for one part. Essentially, some duke was hiring us to take care of some bad dudes. As the assassin was a hotshot, he tried to negotiate with the duke to raise the prices. The GM said that this was unacceptable within play and didn't allow him to make a persuasion check. We thought this was strange, but excused it as we were new. The duke then insulted our characters as evil and sinister. An argument ensued, but the GM prevented us from arguing back. At that point, my friend and I should have just left, but we didn't. The next day, the DM revealed that college was becoming too overwhelming for him, and that he would have to cancel. Most of us were sad, though the first game had a questionable ending. We did have a good time playing as our characters and RPing. The GM noted that my friend and I were particularly good players and would be willing to host for us again when he could do so. Act 1. Dr. DM, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Accept the Railroad. 2 months pass. I host a Pulp Cthulhu game, which was weird, not very good, but universally loved by my players. When I get a message from the DM, he said he had enough time to host again, and he wanted me and the other player to play in his new game. We gladly accepted, and we asked if we could invite some of our newer players, who were our average crew for hosting Pulp Cthulhu, but they would need some help with D&D as they were completely new. He was happy to let them in, and told us that the other 3 we used to play with wouldn't be joining anyway. I had fallen out with the player who invited me in the first place, so I couldn't ask him why he never did join. I'd guess now that it was because he was more experienced and could sniff out a bad DM, but anyway, let's get into the actual cast. F, who was the DM of the game. Tin, the guy who played with me in the first game as a duo. He played a strange warlock called Jesse in this game. Cart, a guy who had joined us for the ending of our Pulp game, We decided to invite him along as he was cool. He had a joint backstory with my character, and he played an artificer named Rami. Cook, a guy who went through our whole pulp game, very good RPer and character maker. He played a Genasi cleric who was focused on a strange artifact. And then myself, a guy playing a weird rogue who was a former spy turned into a whistleblower. His name was Pliskin. Session 0 began, and we pitched our characters. The DM was happy with them, and we were happy with each other's characters. I had a joint backstory with Cart, because he was generally new to TTRPGs, and I wanted to help him. Our whole shtick was that my guy was becoming an expert infiltrator, in order to unearth malicious plots, and that he came across a guy who was just some scientist who was stuck in the middle of a siege on a factory who joined up with my character after they found out that the factory was producing some sort of magical potion which would turn whoever drank it into a horrific creature. Tin was playing a cowboy. He always wanted to do Weird West, so he made a hexblade. Cook was playing his Genasi cleric. He didn't have a clue how to play, as later on we found out that he was not taught by F at all, and the only real knowledge he had was initiative and basic rolling. Seeing that Dungeon Painter Pro was on sale, I bought it for F and myself, hoping that he could make some maps. A few weeks passed, and Session 1 came around. It was set in the same world, but it had been revised with the war being far gone, and there was a sort of alliance between the regions. But there was a secret society trying to start a war up again to cause chaos and dismay between the two realms. A barbaric nomadic tribe was also apparently hunting my character, along with Carts as well. The game began, and it was fairly generic. We went down to a tavern, learned that the long-ruling emperor of the human realm is dead, and there was no confirmation on how he died, and we were never told, but theorized it to be an assassination later on. Our crew was being hired by a strange elf lady who wanted us to go and retrieve the son of the emperor who ran off to a faraway tropical island, which we were told was basically Chult, and was apparently being tormented by some assassins. We accepted the job and ventured forth to a port town. We had a few really boring fights, which we could have easily avoided, but the DM insisted on combat. We arrived at the town, and that was the end of the session. The DM was acting strange, and pressured us for feedback instead of just asking. We gave it to him, and said that the fights were feeling really just forced on us with no build-up, threat, or interest. He said he would work on it. Act 2. The Ballad of the Fisherman Who Ran Away from Our Retcons and Railroads, but were drawn back in. The next week came around, and we were all excited, and the game went ahead. However, we were disappointed. The game was going into a town with a corrupt watch and a crime lord. Groovy premise, mediocre execution. All that really happened is that we were trying to get a boat and pretended we were just fishermen to all the crooks and crooked cops. Of course, a few boring brawls ensued between us and them, and the session ended with us being forced to go along with the mobsters, but then we retaliated. The DM put a really odd joke here when Cook's cleric casted Inflict Wounds on one. The DM said he touched the mobster's crotch, and that the other cried, as it was a very good crotch. None of us laughed, and he was very surprised, apparently. The DM again asked for feedback, and Cart stated he did not like D&D at all so far. Cook was thinking that the game was great, and Tin was having fun, but didn't like the railroads. I gave the DM a good long essay about how to properly do plot hooks. It wasn't a very good essay, but I think he got the message that we shouldn't be forced really hard to do a really optional thing, like meet a crime lord. The next session was a blast, and probably one of the best sessions of the game, though it did have a fair few flaws. Basically, we had to escape from the town and find a way to get to the island. The GM did something really strange and retconned the fact it was a tropical island. He said it was a floating island and introduced blimps into the game. Our characters, through a very comedic, silly, and very fun infiltration, stole a blimp whilst being chased by an entire army and had a few acrobatic duels in the air. This is where I have to give the DM credit. He made everything much more tense and fun by giving it build-up, some payoff, and relevance in the plot with an actual big threat after us now. The caper-esque chases were also a good time for us. The DM was dissatisfied though. He didn't like how our party was doing things, saying that we were too weird and didn't take enough seriously, even though he had a joke about two mobsters being gay earlier. Act 3. Political intrigue isn't fun when you're a badass. The DM had one quick session for us, where we just cruised on a blimp for a while when he introduced us to a new player he had brought in. I won't mention this player in future events, as he was only here for one session, before vanishing and never showing up again. It was a really boring session, and nothing really happened other than us walking about and RPing how we thought the Emperor had died. It wasn't really fun, as we only had one threat, which was equal to 3 pigeons and a seagull. The session ended, and the DM decided he had to delay because of exams. Although his exams had ended since the first game he ever did, and so we waited a month. By the end of the wait, Tin had decided he wanted to leave. He wasn't having much fun anymore, and was just hoping for another Pulp Cthulhu game because the railroading was becoming too much for him. Cook was still optimistic. During this time, I started to get a game ready to host D&D myself, because I was feeling doubtful myself. Cart didn't want to join as he didn't really like D&D, but didn't want to leave F's game yet, as it would be rude to leave in the middle. Cook did join, however, and this part will become relevant later on. Anyway, the game was 1 week away from continuing, when I got a message from F that I should change Pliskin, because he didn't like how he played combat-wise. I thought this was crap, but let him off as I wasn't having too much fun with Pliskin myself. He asked me to consider a political game, with an occasional punch-up, so I made a Goliath politician barbarian with the tavern brawler feat, and he was a pacifist. At this point, the DM stopped being fun in general, and was generally being a jerk. He refused to make maps because he thought his descriptions would speak louder than a map, yet complained and scolded us when we had no clue where to explore around this floating town when he gave us downtime. Eventually, we found the prince was in disguise in a local mine. We tried to persuade him to come back as he was afraid of assassins and that he couldn't make a difference. The DM said that the DC was 23, and I got a 24. I had proficiency in persuasion. And then he immediately said afterwards that it was actually 25. After a 5-minute speech about how a single man could make a difference. This just further irritated me. The next few sessions just got worse and worse. We were staking out a heist to kidnap a duke and spark a revolution. While this was going on, I started my D&D game. Cook wanted to play a cleric there too, and he then revealed to me that F never gave him a pantheon of gods, but just rather some strange scientific explanation for why there is magic in this world, and forced him to pick one artifact as his deity. He also denied him to use his channeled divinity. Fed up with this, I told Cook what a pantheon was, and he was angered. He considered quitting the game right there and then, but then decided not to do so and stay. After hearing a complaint from Cook, F decided that the next session would be the last game and a wrap-up which would answer all the unanswered questions. We had the final session, and it ended up with us instant-killing the big bad leader, who we just met by round 5, by using inflict wounds and dealing a large amount of damage. F was angry, but gave us a conclusion where we sailed off with the prince back to the Empire. The Epilogue. A few weeks pass, and my D&D game was done. I go back to Pulp Cthulhu, and players seemed happy again. When I got a message from F, he asked for feedback so he could improve. I dropped him a large dump of feedback along with the other players, in which he just refused most of it and blamed it upon me as I had doomed his game entirely, before blocking us and never talking again. After this whole shebang, I started to appreciate my players more in Pulp Cthulhu. If I had to deal with a jerk like that for DMing, it wouldn't be fun or worth it at all. But in any case, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have a story that you'd like me to narrate, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.